welcome. Thank you very much for attending this event. We have a fantastic panel for you here. I'm going to take each member in turn. I just want to start off this discussion about the threats faced by to the UK's national security by saying in 2010, when the government produced a document looking at the threats to this country, Russia was not mentioned once in the document in 2010, and China was only mentioned in the context of an upcoming investment summit. So the world has really changed in the past decade. There are also 38 threats specifically listed in the most recent National Risk Register, so I'm not sure we're going to have time to go through all of those. But we'll see where our panelists want to take us. We're going to start with Margaret Beckett, former Foreign Secretary, among much else. And if you'd like to kick us off.
Okay, can I first check that people at the back can hear me, because I've always been accused of having too quiet a voice? Yes? Good, okay. I'm not going to say anything about state threats for two reasons. One is because, as Harry's just pointed out, in the 2010 document there was no mention of Russia, but also, as I recall, the document went on to say it didn't think we faced any state threats. So clearly life has changed rather since then, and I'm assuming that Ben is going to talk about state threats. You can make a list, of course, of the biggest individual threats, and actually the government has such a list. It's called the National Security Risk Assessment. We've had that for quite a long time. But of course, that's not just a list. It's also something that had rankings, a combination of, on the one hand, impact of a particular risk if it were to transpire, and on the other, of likelihood. And as a result of the impact of those two things, there was drawn up a priority list, if you like, in which risks were identified in tiers. I should perhaps say at this point that that is a system that has just been abandoned. I'm not quite clear yet what's replaced it, but certainly, for example, a pandemic was a tier 1 risk under the original system because of its impact. And also because of its likelihood. It was seen to be very much something which was expected, not quite sure when, but very much expected, and for which we were supposed to be prepared. The arrival of the pandemic revealed quite a number of weaknesses of that original system, not least, in my view, that it exposed the fact that a combination of Treasury caution and cuts meant that we were much less well prepared than was the myth, and that's nothing to do with whether or not we got COVID instead of flu. Irrespective of that, it turned out that our stocks were neither the scale that we were expecting nor indeed of the value, the worth that was expected. But there was supposed to be an identified tier 1 risk and a degree of preparation, however flawed in the event that turned out to be. But of course, a possible pandemic was then and remains only one of the major risks that it's possible easily to identify. For example, I would always myself begin with the overarching threat multiplier risk of climate change, which makes such a difference to so many other risks. Indeed, it was a former Chief of Defence Staff who I heard once say that nuclear weapons, which would be another on my list, were the greatest risk to the continued existence of mankind. Sorry, he said humankind. The greatest risk to the existence of the human race, second only, he said, to climate change. But there are other issues. There are the question of the prospect of cyber attacks. There's a whole range of things that you can think of and say, gosh, yes, this is a major risk to the country and we ought to be prepared and ready for that. But one of the things that my committee's taken evidence about, the committee that scrutinises the national security strategy, is that even if you've got such a list, and even if you have that list prioritised, it is nothing like as helpful in focusing attention even on those potential risks, particular risks, than has been assumed. And what strikes me forcibly is that what seems to me to be the greatest threat, or the greatest risk, doesn't seem today to be there in the list of dangers. I'm sorry about that. That's my phone.
That's the greatest risk.
Indeed, that is a well-known risk to which we are all prone. It's funny how you can never kill it when you want to, and yet when you do want to take a call, it's difficult. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, the greatest risk, I think, comes from our interconnectedness and our mutual dependence, and not least the communications that allow information and advice and understanding to flow in the light of those greater interdependencies. As it happens, I've fielded a couple of hospital passes in my political life, and a couple of times they have centred on precisely this issue. So X can continue to provide an expected service if they can rely on Y. And Y can deliver the protected service, the expected service, if they can depend on X and indeed also Z. And X, Y, and Z are services like electricity, telecoms, water, all can guarantee if everybody is there and working.
Can I just pick it up
Yes.
and bring it along, and we'll come back to some of the further points?
You can,
So-
but let me say just one more thing.
Okay.
If you start to look at these things in the round, you quickly realise that what we're tremendously dependent on is communications. And if you get a power outage of some kind, for whatever reason, to my mind, that makes us, as a society, incredibly vulnerable. And solving those issues of interconnectedness is something government's not very good at.
Brilliant. Okay, so we had everything from being unready for the pandemic, climate change, cyber attacks, and of course the interconnected nature of risks, especially to our communications infrastructure. Now I'm going to turn to Dr. Patricia Lewis, Director of sorry about this.
International Security Program.
Thank you. I knew Chatham House, I just couldn't quite remember the wording of that. To take us through how you see this.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really pleased to see everybody. It's such a great audience. And it's also a really important day because it's the day in which the NATO summit begins, right? So we're all focusing our minds on these issues, and I agree with everything that Margaret has said. And I wanted to make just my top three risks and threats. And the first one, it won't surprise you, is the urgent threat and risk of a major war. We're seeing at the moment now with Russia the risk that we're facing in Europe. And it's no surprise, but we also have to keep our eye on another large state, that's China, over time, and the threats that China might pose going forward. And most importantly, look at how we reduce that threat, reduce that risk. And one of the things I think that we often try to do in the international system is focus too much on trust. And actually, it can be easier not to trust. It's easier, it's more transactional, it's clearer. You perhaps are not fooling yourself. So eyes wide open, deals done, security arrangements discussed, but without the vanity, if you like, of believing that you're building trust and confidence. So the other thing I'd like to say is that I really wish that we'd got rid of nuclear weapons in the 90s, completely, globally. I'm not a unilateralist, I'm a multilateralist, and I think the work that you did, Margaret, when you were Secretary of Foreign Affairs, was really important because at the UN level, the UK really led on this issue for quite a few years. And if we had got rid of nuclear weapons, I don't think we'd be as frightened as President Putin as we are at the moment. I think NATO is handling it really well, I should say. I think hats off to NATO that haven't responded in kind, and they've responded with the sort of responsibility that we would expect, and I think that's been really good. So most importantly, I think what we have to do in terms of looking at the threat of war is to prepare, to try to deter, but we have to understand what deters and be very smart about our defence spending, and think all the time about preparedness and adaptation and resilience. And then my second big threat is climate change and the impact that extreme weather events and long-term climate change will have on our security in terms of instability, movement of people, lack of capacity, overwhelming situations in which people are unable to cope. And for that, I think we really do need to prepare and adapt. Yes, we have to try to do everything we can to reduce the risk and reduce the threat, but most importantly, we have to be prepared. And then my third one, and this is perhaps a little bit not in sync with the others, but it's the lack of trust in official information, which I think is undermining all of our attempts to prepare, all of our attempts to grapple with these big situations. It impedes our ability to respond. And the truth is that all of our governments around the world have lied to their citizens on occasions. And this has been undermining the way in which government and citizens interact. And this has to be put right, I think. And I'm not sure I've got all the answers, but I'm sure people in the audience have. But at the moment, we're an open target for disinformation because of that. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And just talking of the audience, if you go onto Slido, if you weren't here earlier, which is spelled SLIDO, you can go in browser and you can submit a question to the panel. We'll have time to talk about that. They'll come through to my pad. The code is NSLive22. So when you go onto Slido, it'll ask for a code. If you just put NSLive22, submit a question, put your name in, it'll come through to my iPad. Keen to ask as many questions as possible, so please do so. Let's go over to, just to summarize, Dr. Patricia's points, a major war, climate change, and a lack of trust, which is proving really corrosive for many democracies. Dr. Charles Woodburn, Group Chief Creative Officer, Executive Officer at BAE Systems, highly creative, I'm sure. If you could give us your threats, I'd love that.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different, but I think it is linked to the prior two panelists, is I think the biggest threat that we face, that I've seen, is complacency. We can end up being very complacent to the threats that are out there. I haven't spent my career in defence. I came into the defence world about 7 years ago. And in my first year, I remember telling my wife when I went home, having seen either Russian sub-activity in the North Atlantic or the cyber threats that we were facing and trying to protect this country from, why is that not more in the public discourse in the light of the annexation of Crimea in 2014? Why do people not talk more about this? And I think that level of complacency allows us, and present company accepted on this panel, but there is a level of complacency there that allows us to sleepwalk into some very tricky situations. And a good example of that for me is in the last couple of years is the way that complacency had somewhat leached into even our financial class. So for example, a lot of our investors here in London were finding themselves in a position where they couldn't actually invest in a defence company because we were involved in the UK's nuclear deterrent. And in fact, I had a rather bizarre situation where one of our biggest investors of our pension fund money, BAE has a big pension fund for the 200,000 plus pensioners that we support across the UK. And they wrote to us and said that they could no longer invest in BAE stock because of their own ethical funding guidelines. And of course, we had the ability, because it was our pension fund, to put our money elsewhere, but that was the kind of problem that we were facing ourselves up against. And obviously the situation, the very tragic war in Europe now, has changed people's perceptions of defence and the need for defence and the role of defence and security as being the first priority of government. But I would still suggest that one of the things that I worry about is what's to stop us from slipping back into that level of complacency that found us very much in the situation that we were in.
Brilliant. And now over to Ben Wallace, Secretary of Defence, MP since 2005. Not quite as long as Margaret. Go back to 1974 was your first term. But Secretary of State, if you could take us through what you think the major threats are.
Thank you. I think the first threat to us all is not to recognise how the world has changed. If I were to give you two examples of how I think the world has changed, one is from my previous time as security minister. If you remember, there was the ISIS attack in Nice, where the guy drove the lorry and ran over a holiday of tourists on holiday. That was the sort of story that 20 years ago would have appeared once on the front of a newspaper in the UK and then disappeared into a factory chip wrapper, and it would have been a terrorist attack a long way away. In today's world, it was streamed live by the terrorists. It appeared in my constituents in Preston, in their web, on their Twitter, on their social media, and made people much more anxious. Still a long way away, but in today's world, it was so much more connected and more communicated. And if I take the other example of Afghanistan, the collapse in Afghanistan, the op-pitting evacuation that we led in the UK to get people out, again, if that had happened, if the fall of Kabul had happened in 1980 or 1975, it would have been much less connected to the rest of the world and the impact. And I remember saying to the United States, I think at the time, the Trump administration, about the deal, that Afghan matters because China is watching. Afghanistan matters because the Middle East is watching about US security guarantees. It's all much more connected in the 21st century than it has been in the 20th century. And so the ability for people to both manipulate that connectivity, both in the civilian world, the sub-threshold, the critical national infrastructure world, the cyber world, or indeed in the information world, is so much more greater. So we are, first and foremost, much more vulnerable than I think we have ever been to a range of manipulations or threats, because we live in an open society very much based on that global connectivity. We are globalized and very much reliant on technology. That means we are more vulnerable than we have been. At the same time, because of information, because of the internet, I used to joke when I was security minister, because I was also in charge of child exploitation investigations, organised crime, money laundering, and terrorism threats. And if I could have just switched it off, because the amount of young people who are radicalised, exploited, pointed in the wrong direction through the abuse of the internet or the cyber information campaign is so great. It is frighteningly able to manipulate. And I think the bow around this global world is the internet and social media, and that makes us even more anxious, but it also makes us more vulnerable for that manipulation. And so I think the threat is a broad horizon. I think Charles's point and Margaret's point about critical and risks is what we can game all the risks we want, and all the sort of NSC and the wargaming and the what happens if your electricity is hacked, or what happens if the computers go down. But what we don't really know at the time is what the public think is important at the moment of something failing. So I remember after the WannaCry happened, I was the security minister at the time, and that affected basically the NHS outpatients booking. It wasn't targeted at it, it's just the rampant nature of the computer virus. And I remember saying afterwards, right, have you gone across the whole of Whitehall, the non-security departments, and asked them how vulnerable their computers are? For example, the Rural Payments Agency. Is that viewed as critical? If farmers don't get their rural payments, funnily enough, that does affect food production. But do we think it's critical? Do the public at the time think these things are critical? If you ask my 12-year-old son, if his Xbox goes off, that is ultimately the end of the world for him. But actually, what is today's critical national infrastructure versus what it was 25 years ago, and I think you'll find the public have a very different order of priority. And that's why Charles's point about where's defence in that, and also where's resilience. Resilience is the most important phrase. Now, I know the New Statesman often used to do articles against it, but when I was doing counter-terrorism policy, prevent was as important as catching bad guys by going through windows and catching them in the act. Resilience is as important as buying tanks and planes and other deterrents to bad people around the world. And that is why I think it's really important that we have a public conversation about defence and resilience and who funds it and how much priority is in it. The private sector can fund some of the resilience. The insurance market, there's something called Pool RE, which is counter-terrorism insurance. It top slices all the big insurance companies. It's got a huge amount of money, and its main job was originally, if you remember when the IRA used to target the city, it was about trying to protect the financial sector. It's been broadened out. So there is some solutions of resilience, and therefore there's an incentive for insurance companies to make sure private companies design better, put in cybersecurity. But there's also a role for government, and we need that discourse. Obviously, as a defence secretary, I battle my other colleagues in departments for budgets. But every time the NHS has a winter crisis, and as long as I've been in politics, both in opposition and government, there's a winter crisis, government and chancellors respond to that. Not sure they respond to threat increases around the world in the same way. It just doesn't get into that political top 3 or 4 that motivate chancellors and prime ministers of the day, mainly because it's a long-term thing, and British governments are not particularly good at long-term investment of whatever colour, and that is something that I think we also have a bigger problem to deal with, whether that's infrastructure or other. Henry.
And just on that, Secretary of State, you said that, as you're pointing out, the level of funding needs to go up as the threat level changes, as the facts change. Is it right that you've asked for defence spending?
I have made, so the media that I've asked for 2.5% of GDP, no. I went through all the letters that I've sent to the Prime Minister and Chancellor over the last few years. No, I haven't asked for 2.5%. No specific number have I asked for. I've obviously done what any other Secretary of State would have done before the spring statement, which is say this is the impact of inflation, this is the impact of the threat. We need to have a discussion. But in the here and now, in this financial year, next financial year, I'm set. I couldn't spend the extra money if I had it. Another problem of government departments, by the way. They're always very quick to put their hand up, but getting money out of the door, you know, building roads, building houses, actually takes time. Building tanks, building aircraft carriers, all those things. So, no, not as reported. Sorry to disappoint. I have, of course, said, and what I'm going to say in my next speech at RUSI, which is, you know, I was that soldier in 1991 when the Cold War came to the end and the Treasury took their peace dividend. They've kept taking it. They keep taking it every year. There is a time, as any investor, sometimes you take the dividend, but sometimes you invest. And if the threat changes, you need to have that discussion about investing rather than taking dividend.
Just quickly on this, what level of GDP would you like to see defence spending get to over the...
You asked the Secretary of State for Defence what type of GDP level you'd like for Defence. It'd be like way up there. I mean...
What do you think is realistic over the next,
enough
over the next
to
5 years?
Two things define defence spending, and both governments, or all governments of colours have been at fault for this, is two things. First of all, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and the other departments' appetite has to match the actual ability to deliver. And Prime Minister after Prime Minister after Prime Minister and everybody else, they love to, you know, walk the G8s, the G7s, they all love to sort of proffer stuff. But it's going to cost, right? And so often defence is playing catch-up with the ambition of whatever Prime Minister came before or the one before that. So first of all, matching appetite and stomach size is really a really important thing. Defence can do lots of stuff. We can be all over the world. We could open a Pacific base if we wanted to, but we don't have the money. So the first thing is cut your cloth to your ambition. That is, I think, the very first thing when it comes to defence spending. And secondly, define your priorities by the threat. You know, the one thing going from Security Minister, where every day I was into domestic plots and foreign terrorist plots, the threat drove MI5 every morning and the police. That's what actually they come into work to face. The MOD wasn't sort of operating like that. So we have to be threat-driven, because that is the demand signal when we don't have a war. So we need to look at the threat, use our intelligence services, use the Joint Intelligence Committee, define the threat, and that will help set your budget.
And just finally to press you though, given the level of ambition that we now have and the level of threat, is 2.5 a good place to target, or are you targeting 3%?
I'm targeting meeting the threat, and where I don't have the capabilities to meet the threat, I am very lucky that I'm part of one of the best alliances in the world, NATO. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing, which sometimes former generals don't quite understand, is Britain has always got its mass and its capability through alliances. It's why multinational alliances are so important in the world, where we share values and we share technical capabilities. We need to build alliances, and that's why we have strong defence alliances, I'm pleased to say, both in NATO, both in bilateral and bilateral, multilateral alliances around problems we agree on. That is how Britain has always got its mass. If you actually look in history, even the Second World War, we relied on the wider, as it was then, empire, the Commonwealth. You know, the Eighth Army was not entirely made up of young men from Bolton and Preston. It was made up of the Commonwealth and the Australians and New Zealanders and the Indian Army and everything else. I think the last time the British Army could get its mass unilaterally was probably about 1920. So when you hear people say, oh, it's not as good as the Cold War, even then, I was in a brigade in Germany, in West Germany. I was next to an American division and a Dutch brigade. You know, we need to realise that we will always get our mass against the bad guys, effectively you want to call it that way, through alliances.
Well, thank you.
Well, that's okay, because that wasn't part of the EU defence, so you'll be all right on that one. Because we had NATO, and nearly every country in Europe is in NATO, so you'll be all right there. You get the best of both worlds.
Let's broaden it out to the rest of the panel. Where do you think defence spending needs to be, especially on behalf of the Labour Party, Margaret? Where do you think? we need to go?
I'm not going to attempt to set a level, especially if Ben's not going to. But what I would say is that, and maybe this is echoing something he said a moment ago, I don't know whether people realise, well, I expect they do, that at the moment it is expected that there will be further cuts in defence, both in the amount of resources and also in, for example, the number of tanks. I know that our own Shadow Secretary of State has already said, this is a bad idea, we should be looking at it again.
And what do you say to that?
Well, we've got £24 billion extra. That's not a cut in anyone's book, right? But because we chose to spend the money...
Sorry, I was talking about numbers in the army.
All right, okay, well, the first thing there is, the lesson of Ukraine is, you can have an army for a parade ground, massive tanks, massive armoured personnel carriers, which is what the Russians have had, and you get slaughtered on the road because you haven't got a perfectly formed 360-degree capability around your mass. So one of the problems we have is for decades, and I served under both Labour government and Conservative, we had hollowed out armies with lots of vehicles with none of the right protection, none of the spares, none of the ammunition. I mean, what is the point boasting you've got 400 tanks or 200 tanks if they are not properly wrapped by air defence, signals intelligence, electronic warfare, or long-range artillery? And so what did happen in the Defence Command Paper, Margaret, was yes, we reduced the number of tanks. The tanks we've kept, we're going to upgrade to be the most capable in Europe. But also, we took some of that money that we were going to spend on, that I didn't spend on the tanks, and invested in long-range artillery, because artillery ranges have changed for the first time since the First World War. And you can have all the tanks you like, but if your enemy's got 20 kilometres range on you on artillery, as we see what's happening right now in Ukraine, where it's artillery destroying tanks, you're then basically going to war and being very vulnerable. So there was more money, we just didn't choose to spend it in the places that people traditionally do. And if people want to play cat badge politics, I'm afraid, and John, I have a lot of respect for John Healey, but if he wants, numbers game is a dead end, capabilities game is the right game to be in.
I agree completely with that. I think that we also need to look very much at the whole logistics, the supply chains, and of course communications, which is vital in all of this, because that's our weak thing, as you mentioned, including in our own country. But I think one of the problems we've got, and that's the issue of procurement. So what I've seen over many years is that you can identify the threat, you can identify what you need to address that threat, but the amount of time it takes to develop the kit that you need to identify that threat, by that time it's too late. So how do we, this is, I think, our biggest problem in lots of ways. So we could do what the Americans do and throw masses and masses of money at it, which is what they do. And that's not a bad solution, because you end up with things that work when you need them. But if you don't have that kind of money, how do you do it? So it seems to me that the only way is through joint procurement, as you say, through NATO, where each country takes charge of certain things. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, so you have to make sure there is overlap. But that interoperability and that responsibility and making sure that you can work together is the only way forward in terms of procurement. But we have to have more agile procurement.
Charles, can you comment on this?
If I was going to go in a similar direction and basically say that, whatever Ben is able to secure on defence spending increases, we need to make sure it's well spent. We as a company, we try to be a good employer. We've got 35,000 employees here across the UK that support a total of 140,000 jobs. And quite often we take 1,000 people. Well, every year we take 1,000 people into our apprentice schemes, and we're not as good as we should be at telling that side of the story and making sure that we are really an exemplar as a UK employer. From our perspective, there's 5,000 small companies that depend on us as a business. So there's a lot of good things that we do in the communities in which we operate. And I think it's incumbent on us, and partly to make sure that we don't slip back into this complacency, that we do a better job of explaining what we do as a company and as an industry, and make sure that money is spent wisely and sensibly.
There's so many things we could discuss, and I would like to, but I think we just have to mention China briefly and the threat that we face from China. And I'd like each of the panelists to just describe how they see that threat. In what terms would you put it? Patricia, would you take that first?
So China's a growing economy, and it's matching its growth in its economy with somewhat of a lag in military spending. It's increasing its capacity at sea, on land, In space, we haven't mentioned space, and of course that's a really important sector to discuss in our whole deliberations here. But China's certainly growing in military capability and seemingly ambition. Now, the purpose of it, I would imagine, is to make sure that China survives as one large state for the foreseeable future. It's gathering up a huge amount in terms of procurement, in terms of natural resources, etc., through all sorts of very clever deals with smaller countries. So this is the reality we have to face. Now, we can face a very hostile China, or we can face a China that we can work with. And how to do that, I think, is extremely difficult, because a lot of it will depend on what China's ultimate ambitions are. But we have to understand them and get to grips with them and enter into a relationship where that is clear and we're not pretending that everything's rosy.
So Secretary of State?
Yeah, I mean, going back to our resilience, I mean, the lesson of Ukraine is, for Germany, is overdependence makes you vulnerable, right? And first and foremost, China is, as you say, it's growing, it's assertive, it's communist, it doesn't believe in democracy. President Xi is quite open that is not the system he thinks that works. It is at one level, it is a competition of ideals. Welcome to the world that we all came into. For some of us, that was part of the Cold War. It wasn't just offence. It was a split world of ideology. And China is the preeminent communist power in the world that wants to challenge democracy. And that is a reality. It's also the preeminent growing GDP economy in the world, which was, again, definitely different from the Soviet Union at certain parts of its time. And therefore, I think we have to address, first and foremost, how, given it's so ideologically different to us, how are we going to improve our resilience from it to allow political leaders to have freedom of manoeuvre on whatever choices they need to make to secure Britain and her allies going forward. So, we don't have the freedom of manoeuvre as we should, and nor does the United States, interestingly enough, despite its rhetoric, because of the overdependence on a Chinese manufacturing base or a Chinese base funding, etc., around the world and investment. And therefore, I think the first way we deal with the challenge of China, as well as the threat to our values and belief system, is start now, because the writing is on the wall at some stage that eventually ideologies will clash, or there will be a point of proper dispute that causes a much higher level of threat. And therefore, let's think about that dependency and think about it collectively as a state and get on with it. And I think that's the first lesson. So that whenever this happens, whenever there's who knows what will happen to Taiwan? There's lots of speculation. But long after I'm gone, whoever is the Prime Minister of the day, whoever is the President of the United States, needs that freedom of manoeuvre to know they're not stuck in a corner which you see slightly Germany has to do with Putin. They clearly would love to move away from where they are, but they are so over-dependent on Russian gas. Their options are limited.
Andrew asks, are electronics from China not the exact equivalent of oil from Russia? On that theme of dependency, Margaret, how would you characterise the threat from China?
I think that's right. I think that is a very great risk. But I just want to say something else. I have a very simple approach to China because of two things. First, decades ago, I was told by a very senior Chinese politician that what matters most when you're the leader of China is whether you can feed your people today. And secondly, I know that there is some, again, decades ago research which shows that the impact of climate change on China means that the amount of usable agricultural land will dwindle away dramatically, and the yields that you get from what land you have left will dwindle as much, if not more. And so I have always, for many years now, thought, I wonder where China is going to go. And that Patricia spoke about the investment that's being made in China's military might. To me, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I'm not going to sound like a stuck record. I think the biggest danger with China is back on complacency, that we underestimate them. I spent in my oil and gas days quite a lot of time in China setting up manufacturing centres, and used to come back with, frankly, the utmost respect for their technical capabilities, their work ethic, their ability to get things done. They take a long-term view on things, and I think that we in the West are in danger always of underestimating China, and even looking at their defence budgets. I can tell you that a dollar or a pound goes a lot further in China than it does in the West. And when you look at just the pure numbers and maybe try and seek some solace from what their spending is compared to total NATO spending, for example, we should not be reassured by that. So I just come back on the fact that it all comes down to complacency, and I have the utmost respect for their technical capabilities and what they're spending and what they're producing, as some people have said, in terms of warship capability. It's a British Navy or Royal Navy every year they're producing in terms of new capability.
Noah Key asks, what threats does the UK face from food security or insecurity, and how has this been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, by Brexit and by climate change? So take your pick. Patricia, would you like to pick it up?
Well, so Chatham has done quite a lot on food security. I'm not the expert on it, let me say, but yes, we've identified it as a major risk, global major risk. Obviously, food security or insecurity affects the poorest people worst, as always. So those who can afford to buy food will be able to pay the money that it takes to buy the food, and those who can't will starve. And I think that's the biggest problem. We have some major logistics problems that are obviously being exacerbated now by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's blockade. But it's also about climate change and the failure of rains and the desertification and the salination, etc. What's happening?
Secretary of State, what can we do about the blockade in Ukraine?
Well, first and foremost, she's absolutely right about the food problem. Not just because of actually, fun enough, Ukraine, but China's growing economic activity and growing populations in India and China will drive the need for more food, and it presents a really interesting problem in the United Kingdom alone, where you've got environmental requirements versus food production. If you talk to the farmers in my constituency, if you do set aside or rewilding, they will say, but hang on, my job is to grow food and you're going to need that. So there's definitely, in sort of the luxury of Europe, Western Europe, there's that sort of debate goes on, forgetting that actually the poorest in the world think about feeding tomorrow. And as Margaret said, China thinks about feeding their population today and tomorrow only, really, in that sense. On Ukraine, exactly, the idea of the ripples. I remember speaking to my Serbian counterpart, and I was the first defence secretary to visit Serbia, I think for a very long time, if at all. And he said, look, we don't want a war with Ukraine. It's nothing to do with Russia, not with Ukraine. It's like we are so dependent on Ukrainian grain. If you go further afield, Libya, 22% of all Libyans' grain comes from Ukraine. 44% of Yemen's grain comes from Ukraine. If they don't feed or get food, they move, or they have real, as you say, horrendous levels of starvation or poverty. And those two things are what we're going to see. And we're all sitting here worried about our gas price. Never mind that. I mean, these people, my Kenyan counterpart couldn't get fertilizer out of Ukraine, which is so important for all the greens we eat most of the time now. So food security is going to suddenly pip or come neck and neck with energy. For some of us, that's always going to be the reality. I went to Turkey last week to speak to the Turks about specifically trying to get more grain out of Ukraine. What can be done? The Turks are speaking to the Russians. There is a difficult problem for the Ukrainians because they mine Odessa, obviously, to protect it from Russian invasion. But, of course, Odessa and those ports are the way out. And, of course, Russia is busy stealing grain. Whose grain is coming out? Are we going to facilitate Russia to steal Ukraine's grain to then sell to somebody to feed their war machine to carry on attacking Ukraine? It creates all the difficult problems, but there is some hope. We will do what we can, both in our defence capabilities, such as helping with surveillance of the Black Sea, if there is a deal done. But I think we shouldn't be over-optimistic that even if you opened all the Ukrainian ports, they roughly can manage 3 million tonnes a month, normally, of output of grain. There are 23 million tonnes of grain to be shifted. So that's 8 months, at least, of trying to get that grain out through even if there is a basic type of sea. One of the things that could be done is overland. I've pressed my colleagues in Europe to try and ask the EU to lift checks because the backlog on those borders are prohibitive. They are hours and hours and days of queues of paperwork, believe it or not, on, like, say, the Polish-Romanian border, and that doesn't help shifting some of that grain. But there is no easy answer. We're trying with the Turks to talk to the Russians, the Turkish talking to the Russians, to see what more we can do. We will do what we can to help. And the other one is the overland routes, which won't get anywhere near 23 million, but it could be better than it is now.
I'd be amiss not to mention the attack yesterday in Ukraine and what more that Britain can do. I know we've done a tremendous amount to assist the Ukrainians with weapons supplies, but is there any plan to send Sky Sabre anti-missile?
Not Sky Sabre. Sky Sabre is almost a brand new system of ourselves. We've only got 3 batteries at the moment. The point about rebalancing our defence is exactly in that area. You know, we were always focused in the past on lots of tanks and not giving them proper air defence. I mean, Britain has no long-range air defence on its ground forces. Right? It relies on the Type 45 or an aircraft to defend it at long range, because we always relied on an alliance. So it won't be Sky Sabre, but we've put in the Stormer vehicle, which is the HVM, the high-velocity missile and low-velocity missile, which are made in Belfast and mounted on vehicles and handheld, and they are having an effect. What we saw yesterday at the supermarket or the shopping centre, this goes to the heart of the cruelty, I think, of Russia, I'm afraid, at the moment. They have deliberately targeted shopping centres to put people out of work, to crash the economy. So I drove from one border of a third country when I went to visit Kyiv 2 weeks. Bizarrely, in the middle of nowhere, you just see blown up shopping centres. And that's deliberately to put people out of work. They're not military targets. They just want to destroy that economy. And therein lies the fundamental danger of that Russian regime.
Margaret, I'm just going to ask you a question from Kimon. We have very little wholly UK arms industry left. The US is not reliable. Don't we need a European alliance with all industries of Europe? What is the solution to our lack of manufacturing base? And I'll bring this to Charles as well. How can we build this up?
I think really, as you say, this is more one for Charles than for me. It's an interesting idea. We've always been rather wary.
The reason I just pressed you, though, is because I know the Labour Party didn't talk a great deal about resilience, which is now such a vogue word when you were in power. I know it's a different era, but do you think, how do we now build up the UK's resilience is essentially what I'm asking.
I mean, I do think that, the key word in all of this, as ever, is resilience, and that applies in defence and it applies across the board. Whether the answer is to get the European defence industries together, I'm not quite so sure, not least what the timescale would be. I certainly don't think it's the answer to the present problems.
Charles, what are the answers here?
I think we have a lot more in the UK than possibly the person who asked the question realises. But equally well in things like the air domain, future fighter, it's always been a team sport in Europe, and our position on Eurofighter obviously is thanks to that, and pretty much every other fighter development programme leading up to that has been a team sport. And looking forward with Tempest, we've obviously got Italy as Sweden as partners on that. So I think that we are. I always pride ourselves as a company of being good collaborators. We take our European partners very seriously. I mean, generally speaking, other sectors of defence, Europe is always, it's difficult when you try and balance, jobs, work share, national sovereignty and capability and put that into an overall European context. And I think that is still very much a struggle today. But certainly in the UK, we have a very strong capability. I think we punch well above our weight on the world stage. I mean, often things like our aircraft carrier programs, in the UK, we report that as it cost more than it should have done, etc. On the world stage, people look at that and think, how did you build 2 65,000-ton aircraft carriers for £6 billion and change? Because nobody else does that on the world stage, barring possibly the Chinese. So I think that we, on some of those big ticket things, and I think the point on defence procurement, we actually can do a very good job. And I think it's important that we do make sure that those areas that we are, showing, you and all of us as British taxpayers that they're getting value for money. And certainly, as I said earlier, if Ben is able to secure more for defence spending, I think that we all want to be reassured that money will be well spent.
Well, that brings me on to, I think, perhaps we only have time for one more question, but the state of Britain's international standing, which is, depending on which paper you read and which day you're reading, it seems to veer from one end to the other. On Ukraine, we're extraordinarily strong. The Northern Ireland Protocol bill attracts many critics. So I'd like to understand from each of you where you think Britain's international standing is at the moment and how well we are working with international partners. Patricia, would you take this up?
Well, I think it's mixed. So I would say at the United Nations, it's high. It's always been high. Remember the Security Council. Obviously, within NATO, it's high. It's a really important part of NATO. We're not doing too well in the European Union, though. So yes, I think it's very mixed. And
But you don't think our reputation is being trashed, as some fear? You think it's a wider picture?
It's a much wider picture, of course. I mean, there are some things in which a government will do very well, and there's some things in which a government will do very badly. I'm not a political party person,
Sure.
And so I don't want to get into all of that. I will leave that to the politicians. So over to you, Ben.
Look, the great thing, and Margaret was saying, when you go abroad, they don't care what party you're in. I mean, and actually, one of my close friends is the socialist defence minister from Spain. She's brilliant, right? And we all get together and you talk usually in the most pragmatic way and you try and problem solve. And whether that is a G7, whether that is a NATO or anything else, it is an environment where all the things that you think your domestic media obsess about are set aside and you discover two things. One is, funnily enough, they've got similar problems. So I remember going to Denmark in the middle of the COVID crisis, and they were about to lose their government because someone ordered the culling of the mink on a WhatsApp, and it was the #1 top political story in Denmark, dominated. Who did they use the right route to cull all the mink, whatever they keep in Denmark? And I went last week to Norway, and there was a rail strike. All the teachers went out on strike in the Czech Republic, and Sweden hadn't recruited enough people at their airports, so all the airlines were cancelled, leaving Stockholm Airport. All sounds familiar, doesn't it? But our media don't say, by the way, that wage pressure is a problem across Europe at the moment. Strike action is happening across Europe, but you wouldn't quite know. And I think when it comes to what is Britain's reputation in the world, if you read our domestic papers, which, let's face it, are not actually where you're trying to make the impression. You're trying to make the impression with the French and the German papers and everything else. I think you would be wrong if you thought that Britain was like down and out. I think what you're finding is Ukraine is, people have said, actually, there's a lot more important things in the world. Our values are under threat. Whether you're in the EU or not in the EU, all those values are being threatened. They have looked across the Atlantic for both the current administration and the previous one, and everyone has a question mark about where is America in the 21st century? What is it going to be and do in the way that, I don't know if anyone has seen the latest Top Gun. I took my children to the Top Gun 2, and someone said, what's it like? I said, it's unashamedly 1980s, United States leads the free world. It's a good film, but it's very, it's whatever you call it. It's 1980s. Yeah. It's probably classic, But actually, there was a slight sense of comfort as that you remember that. That was how America portrayed itself and wanted to be. And I think there's a lot of questions in the international community. And the one thing is actually, Britain is looking pretty consistent on standing up for its values. And even within Europe, don't think we are unpopular in Europe. We might be on some issues around the protocol and things like that. But we've got the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force. That's the 10-nation force. It's 9 Nordic countries in Britain. We're the framework nation. Sweden, when Sweden and Finland were seeking to join NATO, they're very close to us. We did a mutual security pact with them before NATO applications. Many countries in Europe are looking to Britain. Poland, we've done lots of recent deals with Poland. They are keen for us on that area. And Richard Marles, my new Labour counterpart in Australia, he's a fantastic new defence minister. Again, I don't think it comes up. I went to see the last government in Sydney. They didn't talk about some of these things. So overall, I think Britain is on the up. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think as long as we keep investing and standing for what we believe in and working with allies wherever we find them that fit our values, then I think we are in the right place. But we've all got big challenges post-COVID and economies and everything else, and that will never change those things.
I'm going to have to definitely wrap up. But Margaret, just quickly, and Charles, you've been out of power for 12 years now. In what way do you think the UK's international standing has been damaged by this Conservative government?
I think that where Ben is right is that we have a sound and solid reputation in all sorts of fields across the world, earned by previous governments of whatever political shade. And we are trading on that very heavily. But I go back actually to Patricia's final point in her opening remarks. All of that ultimately is dependent, vitally dependent, and this is why Ben gets a good reputation where he goes. It's all dependent on whether people think you can be trusted and whether they think you can be relied on. And that's where I think we have our major weakness.
Charles is fine.
Well, just in my world, I deal obviously with military customers all over the world, and I have to say that our brave men and women in uniform, they are widely respected on the world stage, and with good reason. And that certainly, makes my job in the defence sector much easier, because they end up being, when our people are using it, people use them as a reference on the world stage. So I think we can all be reassured, at least, that our armed forces are highly regarded all over the world.
But tearing up treaties doesn't help.
It's not just the government of any day that creates Britain's reputation. It is our people. It is the scientists. It is the businesses. It is our culture. It doesn't always rest on the British government of the day. Can I just say that? People reach out to academics across the world, whether it's from the Philippines to our institutions. Our reputation in history and in the present day is not purely made on the government of the day, and we shouldn't ever forget that.
That is 1,000% true, and that's why it's so important our politicians don't let them down.
Brilliant.
That's a great note on which to end. There's a 5-minute break now before the next event. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists for a fantastic session. I'm sorry it can go on for longer.